Have you ever been to a place where maybe you go there like once a year, or you visit a place from your childhood, and when you get there, you notice how different you are from the time that you were there last? Have you ever experienced that? Maybe you've had to visit your old school for something, and everything's so much smaller than you remember, but it still smells the same. Don't know if you ever experienced that. Or, if you go on holiday somewhere every year, have you ever experienced that before? Well, I experience this pretty much every year when over the last, 12 or so years, I've been going down to Shepton Mallet in the summer for Soul Survivor and Momentum. First when I was in youth, and then when I was a student, and now when I take our youth group down there. And every year, when you start to smell the fields and the cows as you're driving closer, living in a city, you don't get that every day. You're driving closer, and you start to realize maybe how different you are, or the things that you've done, or what's happened, since you were there 12 months ago. But a couple of years ago, I was there, and I turned up. I remember the worship starting in the first meeting, and they were starting to talk, and I realized, I was like, in this past year, I feel like I'm exactly the same as a year ago. It's almost like a year's just flown by. And I was trying to think, how have I grown this year? What things have I made happen this year? And I was like, it's like I was here last year. I couldn't pin down a difference. And it was a real wake-up call for me about how do we, as leaders and young leaders, make things happen, both in our own lives and in the churches that we serve and in the places that we are. Because we've been talking about this morning already, do you find as young leaders or as young people, or even just in our churches and in our places, we've got ideas, we've got dreams, we've got goals, we feel like we've got something to offer. Sometimes we can spot a problem, or we can spot, we got something in our heart or on our mind, but you find sometimes there's a disconnect between what we feel in our heart and actually what we bring into reality. And sometimes there's that disconnect of making things happen. And today we're looking at the habits of leaders, and I just got one simple habit for us which can help us to get moving in this making things happen stage, especially when we're struggling from getting to A to B. And it's as simple as this. The first thing is identifying our priorities. What is it that God has asked me to do at this time right now? What is my priority? What is my goal? And writing it down, making it the top priority of what we do in our diaries, in our to-do lists, scheduling it, that's my priority, identifying it. But then, and this is the key, is breaking that goal, that idea, that vision, that I got something to offer, breaking it down into the steps that will get us from A to B. What is the thing I can do first? And what is then the next thing? And what is the next thing? And breaking that big vision, that big goal down into the simple steps of goal setting so that we can get there. And making those goals realistic and achievable. Do you find often when we're in small group or something and we're chatting about, what would you like to grow in this year? And something like, I'd really love to, I really want to get into the Bible. I've been saying it, I really want to get into the Bible and just, get into God's word and hear his heart and get into it. And then 6 months later, we're in our small group again, and we're like, what do you want to grow in? I really want to get into the Bible. I really want to, and sometimes we can go 6 months, a year, and we never see it happen, do we? And it's breaking it down into the simple, realistic steps that get us from A to B. So if you are wanting to run a marathon, the first step might be you've got to buy a pair of trainers. Sometimes you've got to break it down, the most obvious, the simple thing. Before you even think about running, I don't even have a pair of trainers. Can I run to the end of my street? Can I run to the end of the next street? Breaking it down as simple as possible. And as we do the small steps with God, trusting in him, looking to him, hearing from him, that's when he shows up, he empowers us, and he does infinitely more than we could possibly ask or imagine. And I got a story for you. I've heard a few great stories today already about someone who was leading up and who broke down their vision into goals so that they could get there, so that they could get from A to B. And it was Jonathan. And as we know, Jonathan was the son of Saul, and he was leading up. He was a man who had to lead up. He had to lead up to King Saul, who Tim called a psychopath this morning. And at the same time, he was leading up to David, who was the future king. And Jonathan was someone who was able to lead up to both of these men at the same time and be extremely loyal. He was supremely loyal. He even died on the same battlefield as Saul, the psychopath. He was loyal, and yet he was a man of incredible influence. Not just seeing God work in his own life, but seeing God work and bring out his purposes in the whole nation because of his influence as he led up. And I want to take you back to the story in 1 Samuel 14, when the Israelites are surrounded and hiding in caves, afraid and in fear. They're surrounded by the Philistines. It's not a good time. We don't really know where Saul is at this very moment. And at this moment, Jonathan turns to his armor bearer in 1 Samuel 14, and he says, come on, let's go over to where the Philistines have their outpost. So he sees the problem. The Israelites were surrounded, we're being defeated, we're hiding away. He wants to do something. Come on, let's go over. He's going to make it happen. He takes his first step. Let's go over to where the Philistines are. And so him and his armor bearer, they climb down between two rocks. And once they've climbed down, he then turns to his armor bearer and says, the next thing, let's go across to the outpost of those pagans. Jonathan said to his armor bearer, perhaps the Lord will help us, for nothing can hinder the Lord. He can win a battle, whether many or few. And his armor bearer turns to him and says, this is my favorite bit, do what you think is best. I'm completely with you, whatever you decide. Isn't that a great attitude to have? Brilliant. So then Jonathan says, okay then. So he's decided to go over to the outpost. They've climbed down the cliff. Now they've crossed to the other side. And he says next, all right then, we'll cross over and let them see us. And if they say, stay where you are, and we'll kill you, then we won't do anything. But if they say, come on up and we'll have a fight, who can, come and have a go if you think you're hard enough, who wants some? If they say that to us, then we'll know that God is handing them over to us. And so they come out and they show themselves to the Philistines, and they look down and they say, oh, look, the Hebrews are coming out of their holes. They had Welsh accents, I think. The Hebrews are coming out of their holes. Come on up, who wants some? We'll teach you a lesson. So Jonathan now, he knows that's the signal. So he turns to his armor bearer, okay, follow me up the cliff. And he says they climbed up, hand and feet. And then as they came over the top, God, amazingly, he empowers them, he's with them, he protects them, and they kill all those Philistines in the outpost, about 20 men in all. Which really, 20 men, it's not actually that many. I mean, there was 2 of them, and they killed 20 between them. So that's pretty good going. But compared to the army that's surrounding the Israelites, 20 men was nothing. But then, suddenly, something happens. It says in verse 15, suddenly, panic broke out amongst the Philistines, both in the camp and in the field. And just then, an earthquake struck. Good timing. And everyone was terrified. And the Philistines panic, they start fighting each other, they go into confusion, the earthquake throws them off, they start killing each other. Saul and the Israelites hiding away and in caves, etc., they see, oh, something's going on. They join in, and all of the Israelites chase away the Philistines. They win a great battle, and God miraculously rescues them through the small steps of Jonathan and his armor bearer. So do you see what's going on here? Jonathan, he's got this vision to rescue Israel. But he doesn't turn to his armor bearer and says, let's go and defeat all the Philistine army. He says, let's go over and have a look at their outpost. And then let's show ourselves and see what God says. Let's climb up. He breaks it down a step at a time. And the same for us. If we're finding ourselves, we've got an idea, we've got a goal, we've got a dream, but we're struggling to make things happen, we're not seeing it come into reality, it's a simple thing to break it down into the goals that will get us from A to B, and to ask the question, what has God asked me to do at this time? What is the first step I can take? And what's the step I can take after that? And then to put it in time, to schedule it, to put it into our diary, to put a deadline on it. And that will make, they say, don't they, a goal is a dream with a deadline. And when we put it in our diaries and we schedule it, it makes things happen. I found this for me recently was in the area of healing. We've been seeing a lot of people healed in the church and across Wales when people were being prayed for. And I really wanted to see more people healed and to be stepping out more in faith to pray for people to be healed. And I work in community projects, and I really wanted to see it in the community that I was serving. And so I broke it down and set myself some goals and said, well, the first thing is I really want to get this right in my head. So my heart and my head, I know that this is what God can do. And a good friend of mine, Bruce Collins, who sees a lot of people healed and prays for people, he'd recently written a book. So I decided the first thing I'm going to do, by the end of the month, I want to read Bruce's book. So I did that. And then, New Wine Cymru were doing some healing cafes. So I decided, well, I'm going to sign up and commit to be on a team at a healing cafe to practice praying for people. So that was my next step. And then I said, in small group and at church, if ever someone complains to me of a physical ailment, then by the end of October, whenever it was, I want to offer to them immediately that I'll pray for them by that time. And then the next one was, we got a treasure hunting team. One of the girls in church started doing some treasure hunting. So I was like, well, I'm going to commit to her that I'm going to come on her team and do treasure hunting. And by the third week, I want to lead one of the groups. That was my next step, to go and then to lead one of the groups. And then finally, my end goal was that wherever I was, if someone complained to me of a physical ailment, that I would say to them, would you like me to pray for you? And that would be, wherever I was, that was like my end goal. And just working through those over the course of a month and sticking to those deadlines, that's the place that I got to. And just a few weeks after that, I bumped into a friend at a barbecue who wasn't a Christian. He complained to me of this martial arts injury that he'd had, and it crippled him from doing any sport. And I offered to pray for him. He got completely healed. Now all of his family have come to Jesus. And I was chatting with him over his house, explaining about faith. And he said to me, I've been thinking about coming to church for 2 years. No, I've been thinking about God for 2 years. But I never thought I could go to a church. I'm so glad that Jesus found me anyway. And sometimes when we just want to make things happen, it's a simple thing of breaking it down. What's the end goal? But what's the first step that I can take that gets me from A to B? So that's our first habit of a leader. Thanks, Chloe.
Great. Should we give him a clap? And that'd be really good for, if it was healing for Matthew that he put in place, what is it for us? And maybe jot down some initial things that, what is that big thing that stands out? Oh yeah, Bible or prayer or mission or speaking to my friends about Jesus. And go away and let's really think about that. And let's, not just think of the first step, but actually put it in the diary to see it happen. Okay, Chris is up next, and Chris is going to talk on self-leadership.
Cool, thank you. Oh. Yeah, good start. Brilliant. Okay. I think what Matt said, the lights are really bright up here. Didn't realise that when I came up here. Just go off the back of what Matt said, I think it's really, really helpful to think about planning and being strategic in the way that we plan. And some of the things I'm going to be talking about today are going to be in how do we go about making sure that our heart is in the right state and we're in the right place in our lives to lead ourselves in and through these things that God calls us to do. So before you listen to what I think about this, let's just listen to a quote quickly. I found this quite interesting. Found it on Google. I don't know who it's from. Sorry. It says, self-leadership is having a developed sense of who you are, what you can do, where you are going, coupled with the ability to influence your communication, emotions, and behavior on the way to getting there. I find this really interesting. The more I thought about it, self-leadership is having a developed sense of who you are, it's your identity, what you can do, it's your gifting, and where you are going, it's your vision, and then with the ability to influence your communication, emotions, and behavior on the way. This is about being self-aware of the way that you come across in your approach to leadership and towards other people. So, why is self-leadership important? Self-leadership is important to a leader because the ability to lead others depends on your ability to lead yourself. There's 3 questions I just want to ask you, and we'll come back to these at the end. I just want to get you thinking now, and then at the end I'll ask them again, and hopefully you can write them down or whatever, and hopefully it will just prompt you to think a bit more about the way you lead yourself. So it's, how do you respond when life gets tough? Do you know the authority that you walk in? And who is helping you to lead yourself? Okay. So whether or not we like it, we all have a responsibility to lead. whether it's in your family, in your home, in your church, whatever the capacity is, we all have this responsibility. And I've been considering this topic of self-leadership now for about a month. But in the last week, this passage in Hebrews has come up, and I just really felt it was appropriate for today. It says, Hebrews 5:13-14, anyone who lives on milk, being still an infant, is not acquainted with the teaching about righteousness, but solid food is for the mature, who by constant use have trained themselves to distinguish between good and evil. This is a really interesting passage, and on surface, you think, well, what's that got to do with self-leadership? And I've heard this passage so many times before, and I think we can misunderstand it I've heard people say, we need to get onto meat, we need to get off this milk. But we need to understand as well that actually the milk is really important for us to begin with. I've got an 8-month-old son, and to begin with, he had to go onto the milk to grow his strength. We're starting to wean him now. Eventually, he'll be on solid food. And the same's true for us in our walk with God. Because initially we need to get to grips with our initial understanding of our salvation. We need to discover who God is in our lives. And in the light of that, who we are. So some of the things I'm going to be talking about as we move on to maturing onto solid food. Okay. But this is the same as the passage in Philippians 2, verse 12, where it says we are to continue to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. This is an ongoing process, self-leadership. This isn't something that you start doing for a term or a period in your life. It's something that we have to continue working on how the state of our heart and how we're going to respond in situations. So for me, there was a time in my life when I prayed and prayed about an issue, and I just didn't see it change. I'm sure for some of you, you'll know what it's like to struggle, to go through hard times in life, and it can last for years. But we often resort to either pretending that it either isn't there for the sake of other people so that they see what we want them to see, or that issue becomes so prominent in our lives that we almost take it on as our identity. Does that make sense? Yeah? Cool. But when we truly know our identity in Christ, we understand that we stand in a place where we have relationship with God through what Jesus has done, because we're adopted sons and daughters. And as a result of that, we walk in the authority of Jesus Christ. We have authority over the issues in our lives, and we can take responsibility for them before God. This is part of self-leadership. If you're going through something right now, and you're really struggling, this self-leadership is all about dealing with it. It's about saying, enough's enough. If we don't deal with these issues, like any of us, if we stop eating solid food, if you or I were to go back to milk, we would start to become quite malnourished. We wouldn't develop in the way that we're meant to. So one day I brought this issue before God, and I just poured it out before him. I said, I'm fed up of this getting in between me and my relationship with you. And I knew that I was the person that had to do something about it. So I swallowed my pride, and I got with a church leader that I trusted, and I dealt with it there and then with them. And I can honestly say that since then, that hasn't been an issue. But there comes this time in our lives when we have to take responsibility for the things that stop us in our relationship with God. This was a really key moment for me. It really paved the way for a good pattern in my life of self-leadership. So the first step, which follows quite nicely on, that I want to talk about is accountability as a leader. Accountability is absolutely essential. I cannot encourage you enough. If you're not accountable, please get yourself with someone. I'll explain what that's about. Accountability is about choosing to be vulnerable to someone about your relationship with Jesus and making yourself responsible for your decisions and your actions. In leadership, both in the church and in society, it is detrimental not to be accountable. So, whose responsibility do you think it is to make yourself accountable? It's ours, yeah. Not a rhetorical question. It is ours, yeah. And this is something that God's been speaking to me about more recently as well, because I have made myself accountable, and then I think, well, why haven't they called me to arrange to meet up with me? Well, actually, it's my responsibility. If I want it, I've got to be willing to say to that person, I need to meet up with you again. For my sake, for my own spiritual health, I need this time. I need you. If they've committed themselves to me, I'm saying, right, I'm taking you up on your commitment. I need that. I recommend to you that the person you choose, if you're not already, is someone you respect and trust, is someone who gives good, godly wisdom, and it's someone who's more mature than you in faith. You may even find, actually, that you might be accountable to someone, but like myself, I'm realizing that in my worship leading, I'm not accountable. I don't have anyone I can talk to about it and anywhere for me to grow in that. So that's actually something I'm starting to seek out now. As a worship leader, I need to find someone more mature than me who can help me to grow as a leader in that capacity. But the person you hold yourself accountable to isn't just there to help you deal with personal issues. They're there to hold you to account for the way you lead. And this is really, really important. They're quite different things. In your leadership capacity, you need to be accountable for the way you lead and for the decisions that you make. So the second practical step, and this is my last point here, is self-leadership means self-sustaining. So what I mean by self-sustaining is taking responsibility for the condition of your heart and living in obedience to God. It feeds right back into this accountability relationship. And so to be self-sustaining in our relationship is to set our focus on Christ and surrender everything in us to his purposes. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to get to know somebody. I see them on a Sunday at church, I see them at house group, but I've never spoken to them. I could know a lot about them from my observations, but I wouldn't know them. And so to get to know that person well, I'd actually need to sit down and spend time with them. Actually, I think so often as Christians, we attend so many meetings and we're with Christians so much. I know from personal experience that we neglect so easily the time on our own with God. And it shouldn't be a burden, this should be a joy. And I really want to encourage you. This is something I've been thinking about recently. I've been looking at a book called Simplify by Bill Hybels. It's recommended to me here, actually. And it's been really helpful in looking at how do I spend my time, where do I draw my energy from, and all those types of things. And I highly recommend you have a look at it. But if I could just encourage you, in terms of drawing on God, being self-sustaining, just to spend 15 minutes every day. Just, you don't have to come with a Bible study or anything like that. It's great if you want to include that, please do. But please just spend 15 minutes before, with God. Just silence your heart, get somewhere quiet, surrender everything to him, allow him to speak to you and give you wisdom for the day. And keep reminding yourself of who God is. And just going back to that point I made at the beginning there about the authority that we walk in. This is so important as believers. If you want to progress in your walk with God, if you want to be self-sustaining, you need to know the authority that you walk in, someone who's been covered by the blood of Jesus. And you can only walk in that authority if you know who God is, because when we know who God is, we know who we are. So just to recap the first 3 questions I asked you, and then we'll finish it there. So how do you respond when life gets tough? Do you know the authority that you walk in? And who is helping you to lead yourself? Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Chris. I loved when he said, ability to lead others comes down to the ability to lead ourselves. And also, when we deal with our issues, let's get accountable, but that doesn't mean we can now blame someone else. We still take responsibility for meeting up and being accountable, that knowing our identity leads to more authority, and being on your own with God should be a joy and not a chore. That's good. I really enjoyed that. Thank you, Chris. Okay, over to Jenny for our last one. Jenny is speaking on the company of a leader.
Thanks, Chloe. Okay, so my topic was the company of a leader. And I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about like influence. That means to me influence. Who influences me as I'm growing in my leadership? And when I was thinking about influence, I was like, okay, what has influenced me through my life? And I was thinking, well, as I've grown up, so I was born just about in the 80s, I just got in there. But I pretty much grew up in the 90s. And so I was thinking about, well, what influenced me? And I would say the first CD single that I bought was Britney Spears. That definitely influenced me. All the girls in school absolutely loved her. We would all come to school with our hair in bunches because of that song that she released. And we all, I know for boys this was more so, everyone had to have the latest Pokemon. And for girls, we would collect as many Beanie Babies as possible. So that was like some of the influences as I grew up, interesting ones. But for me, when I was thinking about influence, it was more about like what influenced like the way I looked or what I did. But when I actually looked up the definition, it said influence is the capacity to have an effect on the character, development, or behavior of someone or something. And that actually, it's not just about the way we look or what we're doing, but actually it's influence on our character, our development, or the behavior of someone. And actually, how can we then be influenced for God? How can we, as a leader, be influenced to become a better leader? So I got 3 points. So first of all, who? Who are we spending time with, and who is influencing us? And in Proverbs 13:20, it says, "Walk with the wise and become wise. Associate with fools and get in trouble." And who are we actually associating ourselves with? Who are we allowing to influence our life? And who are we surrounding ourselves with? That they're actually having an influence on our gifts, on our character, on the traits that we build. And Tim Keller, he's a theologian, and he quoted this: "Our character is mainly shaped by our primary social community, the people with whom we eat, play, converse, and study with." So who actually are we surrounded with the most of the time? Who are we spending time with? Who is having the primary influence on our lives? Because they will affect us. And this isn't to say, like, don't spend any time with non-Christians or not with certain friends, but actually, we need to think about who are we spending the majority of time in, who is influencing us, and what do we want to develop in, and are we spending time with those people who are actually good at that? And I know for me, as a personal example now, so when I came to Swansea, I came as a student, and in my first year as a student, I was coming to Cornerstone Church, and there was a prophet that came, and he prophesied over my life lots of stuff, but one of the things was that he said I would prophesy myself. And it was really important for me that I didn't just wait for that to happen, but that I actually had to step out in it and surround myself with people who prophesied. And so I was already in a church that was very fluent in it. I didn't know very much about it. I hadn't done much of it before. But actually I was able to spend time in small groups where prophecy was a natural thing. It was normal. I had a safe place to try it. That I was watching people like Julian and Sarah who were prophesying from the front and seeing how they did it. What was the way that they did it? How did they approach it? And I took up opportunities. I stepped out in it when it came up. And I actually went on a trip with Julian. We went to North Wales when I was doing the internship here. And I was able to step out in it and, like, as well as watching others, do it myself. And I'm continuing to learn. Like, it's still a process. And I'm learning, like, how I can do it better, still watching others, still seeing how I can develop. And this is true for any gift or character or trait that you want to see in your life. So what is it that you want to see? Is it knowledge? Is it wisdom? Is it healing? Is it like a greater faith? Do you want to see prophecy in our life? Do you want to speak in tongues? The ability to, like, speak up the front, to lead, to counsel someone? Like, what is it that you want to see in your own life? And how are you going to get to that? And I know, like, in the Bible, I was thinking of, like, loads of different biblical examples, but what really stood out to me was the disciples with Jesus. There is such, like an obvious example in a way, but they were like fishermen. They knew nothing about their faith or Christianity or anything about that. And they came like just as they were, as like workmen, family men that didn't know anything. And they spent every single day with Jesus, and they watched what he did. They often, like throughout the Bible, you see them being like, why is he doing that? Like they were so confused, but they stood by him and they watched him. And by the time that Jesus died and went to heaven, they were stepping out and doing it themselves, that they were healing the sick, they were casting out demons, and that actually they wouldn't have been able to do that if they hadn't been influenced by Jesus. So let's think what we want to develop and who then already has that. So is there a pastor? Is there a friend? Is there a small group leader, a preacher? Organize to meet up with them, spend time with them, listen to their talks, observe them, and take that, let them influence you. And lastly for that, I remember listening to Sarah give a leadership talk. And one of the things that she said, and it's always stuck with me, was to always be watching others. And like when you're sitting there listening to a talk or leading, not just to take in like what they're saying or what they're talking about, but actually, oh, interesting, I like the way they did that, I'm going to do that. Or, you know, I don't think that would work where I am, and maybe I won't do that. But to constantly be allowing yourself to be influenced. So yeah, that's who. So secondly, what? What are we surrounding ourselves with? What are we watching? What are we reading? What are we spending time doing? And in Proverbs 4:23, it says, guard your heart above all else, for it determines the course of your life. That's massive, isn't it? And in the NLT version, it says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. And that we really, like as in a leadership position, need to be wise about what we're allowing into our hearts, because it will determine the course of our life. So everything we allow in will have an impact on what comes out, whether it's bad, whether it's good. I remember as part of the internship, we did a DCL leadership course, so it's developing courageous leaders. And one of the talks that they gave was talking about what fills or drains your tank. And it was talking about like emotional well-being and spiritual well-being. And that actually, what are you spending your time doing? And not just like thinking about it, but analyzing, right, how much time do I spend doing that? How much time do I spend doing that? And is that a positive influence or is that a negative influence on my life? And so I was thinking about this for myself at the minute. So what really fills my tank is reading books, whether it's fictional books, whether it's like leadership books. I get loads from reading books, and I feel relaxed when I'm doing it. I feel inspired. Like I really feel like it gives me something when I'm reading books, and that really encourages me. So I like to do that. But something that drains my tank is, so recently I've been doing a university course, like a master's, and I found that some of my friends on my course were quite negative, like their attitude was negative. So they were constantly moaning about the work we had to do or the job that they were doing, and that was really a negative influence on me. Like if I spent time with them, I would come home and I'd be like, oh, I can't believe I got all of this to do, or I can't believe this deadline is so soon. And I found myself becoming negative. So just being aware of what fills and drains our tank. And then in Philippians 4:8 it says, and now, dear brothers and sisters, one final thing. Fix your thoughts on what is true and honorable and right and pure and lovely and admirable. Think about things that are excellent and worthy of praise. And when I was thinking about what we surround ourselves with, that sometimes it's not even just a physical thing, like a book or what we're watching, but that actually it can be an attitude or a thought. It can be negative or positive attitudes from people around us. And that actually we need to be surrounding ourselves with positive influences, and we need to go back to what is true, what is in the scriptures, what are the promises of God, and surround ourselves with those things and to let them influence us. So again, it's not about ridding ourselves from all secular things, but actually learning to recognize what is influencing us and being careful what we surround ourselves with. If we know a certain thing does influence us, then let's not surround ourselves with that. And actually, let's intentionally fill our hearts with things that we want to see in our lives that we read books about it, that we spend time listening to things on it, that we do things that actually fill our emotional tank. And finally, as we're talking about influence and what influences us, I could not mention that we influence others as well. So the final point is actually that while we are being influenced, we are actually influencing others. So we are both influencers and the influenced. And I was reading a book by John Maxwell, and Sarah was talking about him earlier. He's a very well-renowned expert on leadership. And he said the definition of leadership is to influence. So like, just naturally, as we are leaders, we are influencing. And in his book as well, he said, sociologists tell us that even the most introverted person will influence 10,000 other people in his lifetime. And like, that's an introverted person who doesn't like spending time with people. So I was thinking, like, as leaders, how many people are we actually influencing? A huge amount. And just think about in your own life, is it like the kids in Sunday school? Is it your own kids? Is it kids we babysit? Is it youth? Is it people in our small group? Is it students, members of the church? If we're standing on a platform, we are influencing them. Is it our friends, our family? But we are all influencing someone. And the question is not if we influence, but what kind of influencer will you be? And are we actually showing commitment, accountability, faith in prayer, continuity in our home life, purity in our relationships? Because even if we don't see it and we don't realizing it, like, an introverted person is influencing 10,000 people in their lifetime. So we are influencing like 10,000 more probably. So even if we don't see it, we are having an effect on those people. So we need to make sure that our lives are right to be able to influence them. So just in conclusion, to remember, the first one, who are we surrounding ourselves with? Who will influence our character, our gifts, the traits we want to see in our life? Secondly, what are we surrounding ourselves with? Are we intentionally surrounding ourselves with positive influences? And are we filling our emotional tank? And finally, we are also influencing others, just like as default. So what kind of influencer will you be? Thanks.
Thanks, Jen. Wow, that was really good, wasn't it? A lot to take away from that one. I love when you were talking about the disciples hanging out with Jesus, that they almost had like a blank slate, but how much they learned, like, live in and breathe in with Jesus, and the people that we hang out with and the influence that they have on us, and the people who hang out with us and the influence we'll have on them. So we're going to go into a time now to discuss those three talks. Before we go into groups, let me just give a quick summary of the talks in case you've forgotten Matthew's by now. So Matthew was talking about identifying our priorities. Let's break it down. Let's break our vision down into goals. What is that first step? And when we have that first step, let's actually schedule it in the diary so it happens. Matthew talked about healing, and he had loads of steps, of process. What is it for us? Chris, he was talking about self-leadership. Who are we? Our identity, gifting, vision. Are we self-aware? Our ability to lead others comes down to our ability to lead ourselves. Knowing our identity leads to more authority. Let's be accountable. Let's have self-leadership. Let's be self-sustaining, spending more time with God. And Jenny, who should be nice and fresh, who influences us? What's our primary influence? What do we want to develop? And who are we spending time with who has that gift that we can learn from? Let's always be watching others. Let's be aware. And what is influencing us? Not just, the things we watch and the things that we read, but also our attitudes. And let's let Scripture and God really influence us. And remember, we are really big influencers too. So that's a very brief summary of the talks.